Hello everyone, and welcome to the third and final lecture in chapter 11. In this lecture, we're going to look at the Turkish rise in Anatolia. This is going to be the first of kind of two lectures that we're going to focus on the Turks. In this one, we're going to look at their beginnings. In the second one, much later in the year, we're going to kind of look at the expansion of what is going to be known as the Ottoman Turkish Empire and how it expands and gets its footing and becomes a dominant power in the region. So here we go. We're going to talk about the beginnings here for the Turks. All right, so to understand the rise of the Turks, you need to understand what's going on with the Islamic culture in the region, or Islamic dynasty in the region at the time, the Abbasids. The Abbasids are starting to lose control, and they're losing control on the peripheries of their empire, whether it's in Spain, across the Strait of Gibraltar in Morocco, as well as in Tunisia, to various different groups. But 868, they lose control of Egypt, which is their main power source hub in North Africa. And if you lose Egypt, that means essentially the Abbasids don't have control of anything in Africa at this point. So that's a problem. And then in 945, the Persians are able to conquer Baghdad. And Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. And this ends the power of the Caliphate itself. Now, the Caliph is still in charge. They're not taken out of power, just out of political power. They're still viewed as a religious leader. Okay, you could kind of think of it as like a like, you know how we talked about in Islam, they don't have a central religious figure. Think of it as, in this case, they kind of do, with the Caliph still being allowed to have religious power. But the Persian rulers now control all political and military means over them. Okay, so the Seljuks. The Seljuks are the first group of Turks that we're going to talk about, and they're going to be the main focus of the Turkish group that we talk about in this lecture. In the later lecture, we're going to talk about the Ottoman Turks, so there's a little bit of a difference. Now, the Seljuks, just like the Mongols that we've talked about, just like the Bedouins and the Berbers, they're a nomadic group of horsemen. They also herded sheep. They help protect caravans using their camels and so forth. They're traders. They move. They're also known for their great military skill. It's a harsh life trying to be nomadic and protect caravans and so forth. So initially, let's go back a few hundred years. The Abbasids actually bought Seljuk Turks when they were children to train them as soldiers because they knew their background was a strong military background. And this is where, if you ever hear the term Mamelukes, this is where these group of soldiers. They're Mamluks. They're Seljuk Turks that were bought and trained by the Abbasids. They convert them to Islam, and then as this moves forward, a majority of the Seljuk community converts to Islam and then migrates into the Abbasid Empire and kind of settles down. Okay, so this happens. Now, as the time goes on, the Persians are starting, their empire is starting to crumble a little bit. They're starting to have some issues. This is the Sassanid Empire, to help you guys understand in terms of, like, if we were to talk about a specific empire here. They start to lose some power and control, like we talked about back in chapter 10, and the Turks are able to capture the city of Baghdad from the Persians. This is important because Baghdad's a significant city in pretty much any means, politically, culturally, socially, economically, whatever you want to talk about. Now, here's another reason why they're important. 16 years later, in the year 1071, the Seljuk Turks, with a smaller army, are able to crush a Byzantine army in eastern Anatolia at the Battle of Manzikert. Now, this is significant for two reasons. One, it's pretty much the beginning of the end of the Byzantine Empire. It kind of starts that final domino. Even though it's going to take nearly 400 years for the empire to fall, this is where it's going to start to end. Two, this is where the beginning of dominance is going to take place for the Seljuks and eventually the Ottoman Turks to take control of the Middle East. Okay, this is going to kind of be the forerunner, the first steps of the Ottoman Empire many, many, many centuries later, taking control of all of this moving forward. Okay, and the Turks are able to control a majority of Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert very quickly. Okay, so the Turks and Persians had to learn how to cooperate in a various number of ways. The Seljuks gained support from the Persians through favorable treatment. Again, we see this throughout many cultures. We've talked about it specifically with the Islamic cultures in the Caliphate in the first section. How do you get people that you're conquering to follow you? You treat them as favorably as possible. Try not to change life as much as possible, and so forth. Well, how do they do this? Initially, one is the Turks decide to choose their capital to be the city of Isfahan, which was the capital of the Persian or Sassanid Empire. So you're not changing the power base. That's number one. And then two, they name as a vizier Nizam al-Mulk, who was Persian. So you have a connection there that has a person in high power that is not Turkish, they're Persian. So you have people working together. And then also the Turks themselves were illiterate. So they used the Persians to help educate themselves. And this is a connection you're going to start to see a mixture of people, mixture of culture taking place in and of itself that we'll talk about much later in the course when we get to the Safavid Empire, and that becomes much more of a topic that we focus on specifically. Now, all rulers take the name of Shah, which is just Persian for the name king. So there's a connection there in terms of language, linking back to the previous point we talked about in terms of Persians teaching Turkish, how to read and write and so forth. All right, so further cooperations that move forward. Seljuks adopt the Persian language. You see Arabic is only maintained through the Quran itself. Remember, the Quran can only be worshipped in Arabic to show that connection across everybody if you're a Muslim, regardless of your culture. And this is where there's a misnomer. A lot of Westerners think, oh, well, Persian and Arabic are the same thing. They're not. They're completely different religions. Persian, typically, you have like Farsi is what they speak, and then you have Arabic. Two different, completely different languages. So even though you have that adoption by the Turks themselves, they still have to know Arabic for the Quran. Both cultures do. Malik Shah was one of the most important sultans of this time. He focused on building the Seljuk culture to show off who they were. Particularly, again, this is an art in learning as well as in religion. There's several beautiful mosques that were built during his rule. Masjid-i-Jam, you guys can see here, this is an example of what Malik Shah tried to do to focus on building Seljuk culture at the time. So I'm showing you guys this map because of the date itself. The Seljuk Empire, this is the area they had under control, with the main orange area being full control, and then you kind of have this like client state area under dispute off to the northeast, and this is at 1092. Now this is important because look at the amount of territory they control. Most of Anatolia, you have present-day Iran, or this would be what we call Persia, most of Iraq, and then we have Syria, Lebanon, and then what we have is Israel, or the Holy Land, and in particular Jerusalem is under the control of the Seljuk Empire. Now the date here is 1092. This is important because this is the year that Malik Shah dies. Okay? Now, Malik Shah dies unexpectedly. And when he dies, he's a strong ruler. Pretty much any time in history, you see a strong ruler die, there's some kind of disintegration in loss in some form, whether it's economically, politically, military, whatever. But in this case, the empire disintegrates into just tons of kingdoms all across the empire itself. And this is important because when you combine it with the other actions that are going on, such as the Byzantine emperor writing to the Pope in Rome, saying, look, we need your help, to the Western European groups, such as the Pope and other leaders, thinking, hey, we need to take back the Holy Land and have it under Christian control, coming together, all drives home this idea that the Holy Land is ripe for the taking. Christianity can go and take it back and control the Holy Land for itself, and the Muslims will no longer be able to control it. Okay, so when Malik Shah dies, this opens the door for the Crusades to start. So in 1095, Pope Urban II launches the First Crusade with the goal of driving the Turks from all of Anatolia to help out the Byzantines, and then reclaim the Holy Land, in particular Jerusalem in and of itself, so that it can be a completely Christian-dominated holy region. And the First Crusade is successful. The Christians are able to capture Jerusalem in 1099, but what they end up doing is they end up massacring all Jews and Muslims that are in the city, including some Christians even in the city itself, and establish a Crusader state kingdom centered around Jerusalem, as well as other city-states such as Tyre and Acre in that area. So, to move forward, talk a little bit more about the Crusades. We're going to talk more about them moving forward as well, do a lot on the Crusades in chapter 14. We have a very important Turkish figure here to talk about. His name is Saladin, or Sahaladin, if you hear it in Arabic. And Saladin establishes a very strong Seljuk kingdom in the Middle Eastern region to confront Christians in the Holy Land. And in 1187, he is able to retake Jerusalem from the Muslim, or Jerusalem for the Muslims, not from them. He is Muslim. Sorry. He retakes the city. Now that's essentially in the time of the Second Crusade. Eventually, the Third Crusade comes on very quickly, and Saladin and King Richard, the Lionhearted of England, fight several significant battles in the Third Crusade, and they kind of fight to a standstill. Without getting into too much detail, because we don't have time for that here. But ultimately, what ends up happening is Saladin signs a truce with Richard I, and in that truce, there's an agreement that Jerusalem will stay in the hands of the Muslims. So Saladin retains control of the city. But the city is open for all Christians, as well as Jews. It had already been open for Jews, to worship in the city. Free. They can't be, they won't be hurt, harmed. They're open. The city is completely open for them to visit. Now that's an important brokerage and deal. It doesn't end the Crusades, however. There's going to be as many as 9 Crusades, so 6 more. They're all issued to regain the city, but they're typically easily defeated. The next Crusade, the 4th one, doesn't even make it to Jerusalem. It gets to the gates to Constantinople and sacks the city. So you can see there's a lot of other things, but we'll talk about that moving forward. But ultimately, just so you know, Crusades, they're not successful in retaking the city after the first one, or after they lose it after the second. Okay, so the Seljuks versus the Mongols. So one of the things that we need to talk about here is we need to talk about how the Seljuks and Mongols interacted, because we talked a little bit about the Mongol Empire in the last section with how it affected Russia. Well, the Mongols also affected the Seljuks. So as the Mongols consolidate their power in the central steppes of Asia, in China, and then throughout Central Asia as they expand westward and move westward, they come into contact with the Seljuks. Now, one of their leaders, named Hulagu, he leads the Mongolians to the gates of Baghdad, which is controlled at this time by the Seljuk Turks. He burns the city. He burns the Caliph's palace. Remember, Caliph is a religious figure at this time under the Seljuk Turks. He kills thousands. You can look at page 317. It talks a little bit more about it in your textbook if you'd like. But ultimately, what ends up happening is they burn the palace. They capture the Caliph. Now, the Mongols actually have a rule in their culture. They cannot spill sacred blood physically themselves. So what they end up doing is they take the Caliph and kind of tie him up and then have him killed by horses. He's trampled to death. So they don't actually do it physically themselves. They have animals do it for them. Kind of a loophole, kind of a weird idea there. Now this is famous. This is a primary source from the time, a painting showing Hulagu's burning of Baghdad. All right. Last slide here for the section in the chapter. So the Mongols themselves, they go on to a number of campaigns throughout Asia. They take areas from the Byzantines, the Turks, kind of like we just talked about in the previous slide, and they're able to establish the largest land empire in history. We will talk more in detail about them. I know we've talked a little bit about them here as well in the last section. We actually have 2 big sections in chapter 12 on them specifically. But a few things about them. We have little knowledge of how they administered their empire, mainly because when we look into the empire itself, it grew so large, so fast, and then just in a few generations, it was gone. And what this does is it leads to the rise of another group of Turks. I talked about them earlier in the lecture. Kind of when I mentioned, hey, we're going to talk about the Turks again. It's going to lead to the rise of the Ottoman Turks and the Ottoman Empire that is going to become one of the great empires of kind of the middle period, middle to modern period of history. So, like I said, guys, we got a lot moving forward. We're going to talk and come back to these cultures again, some more recently than others. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is the final lecture for Chapter 11. And as always, please review these, go back through these as you study for the Chapter 11 test, and have a good one.